Tom, thank you very much indeed. 25 to 8. So Reform have a new policy to stop the boats, as a recent Conservative Prime Minister once put it. It's called Operation Fortress and will be spelled out at a press conference later today. They'll set out plans under three broad headings. First, a joint military command made up of units from the Royal Navy, Royal Marines, RAF and British Army will stop what they refer to as an invasion. Second, making the English Channel the most surveilled maritime border in the world. And third, plans for the armed forces to intercept any unauthorised vessel, detain its occupants, provide water and food, and then return them under escort, including to France. They say all of this will be legal. Interestingly, when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, he announced the Royal Navy would take command of counter-migrant operations in the Channel. That was called Operation Isotrope, but never materialised. Let me just give you some facts before we speak to a retired Navy commander and indeed Reform. So between January the 1st and July the 29th of this year, a total of 14,128 people crossed the Channel by small boat from France. That is still a big number, of course, but it's down 42% from the same period last year. Tom Sharp is a retired Royal Navy commander. He served for over 25 years, specialising in military planning and anti-submarine warfare. He joins us now. Commander Sharp, good morning.
Good morning.
What do you make of the Reform plan?
I think it lacks quite a lot of substance. It does feel like Operation Isotrope, as you say, in January 22, when Priti Patel, who was Home Secretary, kind of lobbed this grenade at the Navy and said, fix it. And then really didn't empower them to fix many of the things that they could have helped with. So I think there's a notion that the Royal Navy can steam over the horizon and fix this problem, which, as you say, is declining slightly anyway. The reality, when you start looking at what ships we have, which is basically none. I mean, he's talking about the largest maritime operation in the Channel since World War II, a very evocative image, but that's not the reality. We don't have the ships. And then if you do bring your ships to bear and you start investigating what exactly you're going to do with them and where, then that starts to unravel quite quickly.
So you say we don't have the necessary warships going spare because they're in use elsewhere. Do we have the necessary other ships, smaller ones like the Archer class, for instance?
Yeah, the Archer class could be used, but we have the border force already to do this. Now, a billion-pound warship that's configured for anti-air warfare or anti-submarine warfare, which are both threats to the UK, is not best used ferrying people around. You're better off using an actual ferry. So there are, once we're talking about processing people here and then returning them back to France, that would be much better done by a ship suited to do that.
And brief final thought, do you think this sounds legal and do you think the French would stomach it?
Well, the French thing, I think, is the biggest trip hazard here. They take as many migrants as we do. It used to be more. I think it's now slightly less. The point is, it needs their total approval, which I don't think we'll get. And frankly, a bit brutally, why would we? Yeah. So the French angle, I think, is huge here.
Okay, let me put that to Mr. Yousaf. Commander Sharp, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Mr. Yousaf, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for joining us. You spent the weekend in Ceuta. Let's just start there. What did you see and what did you learn from that trip?
Well, what I saw, so I arrived at the point when probably the majority of the 60,000 or so that stormed the beaches of Ceuta had been returned. But what I saw was something extraordinary, the militarization of that border, thousands of Spanish troops, armored vehicle. And these were not vehicles for crowd control. They were carrying basically weapons of war. On them, I saw soldiers using pepper spray, interacting directly with migrants that were acting in a disorderly fashion. And in using the military, what I saw was Spain was able to effectively send back what looked like north of 40,000 illegal migrants in the space of a day. So what that shows is when Spain deployed, when it meant business and decided to take it seriously under enormous global and European pressure, given the extraordinary images that people were seeing, it actually managed to have, I actually think, looking at the data, an unprecedented effect on illegal migration in the space of 48 hours.
Okay, so perhaps that's inspired the policy that you'll be detailing later today with Mr. Farage. Can I just put to you, did you have a chance to listen to some of the objections to your policy or suggestions that Commander Sharp just made? Because I'd like to go through them with you. One of the things that he said is that it's not entirely clear we've actually got the necessary warships because they're being deployed elsewhere. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so firstly, I have enormous respect for Commander Sharp's service, so that's the first point I'd make. But I don't believe he would have read our plan because we're only publishing our plan at 11 a.m. It's a very substantial document. It was devised actually by people at commander and more senior level than that from the Navy and other armed forces in this country. And it is endorsed by a whole multitude, and their names and ranks are published in the document, commanders and other highly experienced former senior members of our armed forces. So while I never served, respectfully, I would say this is a plan devised by former senior military personnel and endorsed by former senior
Okay, so
personnel. Their
what
names are in the
ships?
document.
So what ships?
that would be the first
We look
point.
forward to
He
reading the
made the,
document.
he made the claim, by the way, I just want to also say that he also seemed to think that our plan involved processing people in Britain. That is not true. Not a single illegal migrant trying to cross the channel will make it to our shores as part of the plan. In terms of do we have the vessels? So the vessels we are talking about using are primarily first of all, the Bay class ships. The second one would be offshore river patrol vessels. And on those vessels, you have these things called RHIBs, rigid hulled inflatable boats. So these are very small, highly maneuverable Navy vessels, which will have Royal Marines on board that will be used to go right up alongside these illegal migrant dinghies, take them on board and escort them back to France. There is significant precedent for that. This is something our Navy has done with great aplomb, these humanitarian missions in places like the Horn of Africa and, of course, during the Troubles.
Okay,
in,
and what happens
Northern
if
Ireland.
the French? What happens if the French don't accept your plan, and therefore, if the French won't accept these people back into France when you attempt to disembark them?
Yeah, so our document envisages two scenarios, one in which the French consent, which, of course, things are more straightforward. In the event that they do not consent, the Marines will nevertheless, given it's a humanitarian mission, and they are obliged, not only under the ECHR Article 2, which, of course, reform will leave immediately, but for what it's worth, the current situation, it's there. Article 2 demands the protection of life. North of 170 illegal migrants have already died making this journey. It's one of the most hazardous journeys that is routinely made in the world in terms of maritime, in terms of the maritime situation. So they will escort the migrants onto the beaches of France. And if the French disagree, what will end up happening is we'll end up having something of an argument with the French. But if we're unwilling to have an argument with the French and the Élysée Palace over the invasion of Britain, given not only have 200,000 arrived, some have gone on to brutally murder British people. Some have gone on to attempt mass casualty terror attacks. And the only reason that didn't happen is due to the brilliance of our security services. We're unwilling to continue to allow
let's just
this
talk about what
outrageous
let's just
situation
go
to
through that in
continue.
some
And that's
detail.
why
Hang on, let me
calling
just
the
ask you that
military
question because
solve
it
the
wasn't clear.
problem is important.
Sorry, let me just pick you up on that because it wasn't entirely clear. So you envision in your plan, which we look forward to reading, two scenarios: one in which the French consent and one in which they don't. In the scenario in which they don't, which is the more likely scenario, according to Commander Sharp and indeed your political opponents, what actually happens? The Marines, under this humanitarian operation, try to get these desperate people to disembark.
Mm-hmm.
The French say no. Then what?
Well, if the French say no, as I said, there are two. The way we would expect the French, if they said no, and I agree, there's a significant potential for that, they would probably attempt to have a diplomatic argument with us. The argument that we would have with them is, number one, the official French position, as things stand today, is that they do not want these boats leaving their shores and coming across.
No, but what
the
actually
channel.
happens
in
in the
fact, we're
operation?
paying them £1 billion, of course.
But what actually happens in the
We're paying them £1
operation?
billion, thanks to the Tories and Labour, to stop the boats from coming.
Sure. What actually happens in the physical operation? Obviously, the diplomacy comes afterwards, and that'd be I'm sure, a fruitful conversation. What actually happens in these humanitarian operations? You get this Royal Navy intervention, you get the armed forces, they escort them with water and food, according to legal and moral obligations, you might argue, back to France.
Correct.
The French don't let them disembark. What actually happens
the French.
then?
So if the French, okay, so if that's what you're putting to me, the notion that the French would not let them disembark, let's talk about what that would mean. That would mean the French committing a crime against humanity. That is what would be happening. This is a boat full of innocent civilians who are being rescued as part of a humanitarian mission. If the French chose to do as you're suggesting, and I'm actually interested in the BBC's putting this to me, the idea that President Macron would order the gendarmerie, the Coast Guard, or anybody else under his control to commit a crime against humanity, which is what that would be, I do not think that that is a serious hypothetical.
And are you persuaded that what you're doing would be legal? Because Commander Sharp had some concerns about whether or not it would be legal. He seems to suggest that what you're suggesting, though he hasn't had the benefit of seeing your plans yet, I'm sure he'll read them in detail, but he seems to suggest that what you're suggesting may not be legal.
Yeah, well, we've got extensive legal opinion on this. It is legal. So again, number one, even if we look at the current situation, we would lead the ECHR, but Article 2 of the ECHR demands of the protection of life. Almost 1%, 1 in 100 of people making this journey are dying. It is one of the most extraordinarily perilous journeys. So that would be the first point. Number two, upon finding a vessel in distress, which this fits the dictionary, every single one of these vessels would be under any applicable international treaty or regulation, well, then our military would be absolutely compelled. They are obliged to rescue these people. And really importantly, France has a commitment under international law to process the asylum claims of all of the relevant people in this conversation, because it is a safe country.
Can I ask you a final question?
And the final point is the Immigration Act of 1971 criminalizes illegal entry into our country. And I want to make the point that just because Tory and Labour governments chose to completely disregard that law doesn't mean that reform will. So it is absolutely legal for us to do this.
Sure. Let me ask you one final question away from migration. Rupert Lowe, the leader of Restore, has appealed to Nigel Farage, saying the patriotic right, as he puts it, should team up. Can you envision circumstances in which he and Restore generally would have a formal alliance with your party, in which there would be a sort of rapprochement?
Well, I think there are lots of people in this country, Restore voters included, who are desperate for this country to turn around, desperate for us to have secure borders, to have mass deportation of illegal migrants, to stand up for law and order, to apply our laws properly and prioritise British citizens. One thing about history in this country, it shows that coalition governments achieve nothing that anybody wants, really. Everyone ends up disappointed. There's only one party with a real chance on the right of winning a majority under our first past the post system and turning this great country around. Nigel Farage has been fighting for these principles for decades. I've dedicated my life to this. We at Reform are going to work incredibly hard to earn the vote of everybody in this great country who believes in those principles.
Okay. Zia Yusuf, thank you very much indeed for joining us.